Alright guys, so this video is going to be part one of metabolism. This particular PowerPoint is going to be the last one in your biochemistry unit. Today we're going to focus on the metabolism portion, and then tomorrow we're going to cover the enzymes which regulate metabolism. And so this is actually a term that you saw in the beginning. The first lesson was called Principles of Life, and one of the characteristics of living things is that they demonstrate metabolism. And so by definition, metabolism is going to be all of the chemical reactions. Okay, and this is important. A lot of times when we think about metabolism, we only associate it with diet and exercise, but metabolism is all of the chemical reactions taking place in an organism. So that could be the building of things like proteins, the building of our DNA, that can be the building of things like polysaccharides, but it can also be all of the other types of reactions too, the breakdown of food, the breakdown of proteins, any type of chemical reaction is going to be included in our metabolism. Now there's two types of metabolic pathways. You have catabolic, also known as catabolism, and then you have anabolic, also known as anabolism. And so the key is what's going on in the chemical reaction. In a catabolic pathway, we are breaking down. So catabolic break, and in the process of breaking bonds, we release energy. Because what bonds do is they store energy. So anytime you make a bond, you're storing energy. Anytime you break a bond, you're going to be releasing energy. So if catabolic release energy by breaking, anabolic are going to be the opposite. They are going to use energy anytime they form bonds. And so this actually kind of goes along with the two examples of chemical reactions that we saw in our macromolecules. We had dehydration synthesis, where we were building molecules, and that would be an example of a reaction that might be in an anabolic pathway. And then we had hydrolysis, where we were breaking molecules, and that would be an example of a reaction that you would see in a catabolic pathway. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of keep a running list here. And so somewhere on your note paper, I want you to create a T-chart. It can be anywhere. But as we go through this metabolism part one, we're going to find that there's a lot of pairs that can kind of fit under one of these two categories. So once again, because I have trouble writing on the lesson, I went ahead and just created a table. But what I want you to do is somewhere on your notes, create a T-chart. And on one side, put catabolic, or you could put catabolism. And on the other side, put anabolic or anabolism. And we're going to be going back and forth between those two. All right, so the first thing I want you to put is that catabolic reactions break down, whereas anabolic reactions build. And I should have made these. All right, the other thing I want you to add here is that when catabolic reactions break down molecules, they are going to release energy, and anabolic pathways are going to store energy or use energy. All right, then we're going to come back to that as we go throughout the lesson. So just kind of keep that table handy, and we'll continue with our pairs here in a little bit. All right. So a lot of times what will happen is in order to keep from being wasteful in our bodies and in our cells, we're going to have what's called energy coupling. And so we have a set of a pathway that's going to release energy, and then we have pathways that need energy. So energy coupling is all about coupling or pairing the two. And so this is where we're going to have a transfer from catabolism to anabolism. So catabolic pathways release energy, anabolic pathways use energy. So the energy released in a catabolic pathway is going to be used to drive those anabolic pathways. And so a very common example of this is a very important molecule. Hopefully you've heard of it and you know what it is, but that is going to be ATP. And so ATP is energy for our cells. It actually comes from the name adenosine triphosphate. And essentially it's a nucleotide. It's kind of like a modified nucleotide. So it looks a lot like an RNA nucleotide. You have a ribose sugar, you have the base adenine, and then instead of just one phosphate like you would find in a typical nucleotide, it has 3 phosphates. And so this is the energy for our cells, and the reason it provides energy is because of this 3rd phosphate here. And so what happens is, by the process of hydrolysis, which means water is added, that 3rd phosphate breaks off. Now notice it says a high energy bond, okay? Now the reason it's high energy is because this portion of the molecule, these phosphates, are an unstable region. And instability equals high energy. If you think about an unstable person, we don't really know what they're going to do. They can be high energy, okay? And so to kind of explain why, I want you to think about this. If you have siblings, okay, think of these like siblings, and think about them being stuck in the back seat of a vehicle on a long vacation, all right? If you've ever experienced that, if you have siblings, you probably know what I'm talking about. So the thing with phosphates is they all have a negative charge, okay? The phosphate little group has an overall charge of negative. Now we know that opposites attract, but like charges do not attract. And so what happens is we have a negative bonded to a negative, bonded to a negative. It's like those siblings in the back seat. They're together, but they really don't want to be together. And we're just kind of waiting for that explosion to happen in the back seat. And so especially on this 3rd phosphate here, this bond is extra high energy. And so what will happen is, when this phosphate breaks off, when it's hydrolyzed, a lot of energy is going to be released from the breaking of that bond. So that would be an example of catabolism. We're breaking a bond and releasing energy. Now, that energy is then going to be used in a reaction that requires it, an anabolic pathway. That energy could be used to transport something across the membrane by a protein. That energy could be used to build another molecule. And so ATP, we're going to look at the ATP cycle, and essentially we're going to break a phosphate and release energy, and then to store energy, we're going to add a phosphate back on. And so once that phosphate group is hydrolyzed, it's transferred to another molecule. We call that phosphorylation. We're actually going to see that term quite a bit in a future lesson, so just kind of be prepared there. And so the phosphate is added to something else, and it transfers the energy with it. Now the thing is once we lose a phosphate, okay, ATP, which has 3 phosphates, if one of those phosphates breaks off, it's no longer ATP, it is now ADP, which is a diphosphate. All right, now the thing is when we make ATP, we do that by adding phosphates onto ADP. Now, in order to add something, in order to build it, it's going to require some energy. And so when we get to cellular respiration and things like that, you're going to see how that energy is used to add those phosphates back on. But essentially this ATP cycle is an example of energy coupling. So here we have ATP. We're going to lose a phosphate. That phosphate is going to be used to energize something else when they're phosphorylated. ATP will become ADP, and then we add a phosphate back on. We store that energy in that unstable bond. It becomes ATP. It breaks off. It can be used to do work in the cell. We add it back on, and so forth. And so this cycle of building and breaking ATP is a prime example of energy coupling. All right, so what is energy? Okay, energy is actually constantly being transformed from one type to another. It's the ability to do work. And you may have seen some of the similar laws that we're about to talk about in other areas. But when we're studying thermodynamics, we're looking at energy transformations. Now, energy transformations are going to occur in a system. And there's 2 types of systems. You have a closed system or you have an open system. Now, think about a closed system as like maybe when you put a frog or a lightning bug into a jar. Okay, when you seal that jar, that is now isolated from its surroundings. And so studying energy transformations in a closed system are going to be pretty simple because you're not going to have a steady input. Okay, it's going to be isolated. Now, fortunately, We are an open system. Living cells and living organisms are open systems, which means energy is constantly being transferred and transformed with its surroundings. This is why if you have a frog or you have a bug in a closed jar, it will not survive, because we have to have that constant exchange between our cells and the environment around them. And so when you're studying thermodynamics, or these energy transformations, there are two laws. Now, I'm not a physics person. The first law of thermodynamics is really easy to understand. The second law of thermodynamics, not so much. And so the main thing is you just need to understand what the laws say, okay? If you can kind of repeat the laws, then you should be good to go. Now, the first law of thermodynamics is the conservation of energy. You've probably heard something similar with the conservation of mass. We know that matter cannot be created or destroyed. The same thing applies when we talk about energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. The amount of energy in the universe is constant. Now, what can happen is the energy can be transferred from one thing to another, or it can be transformed from one form to another. And so examples of the different forms of energy, I'm sure at some point you've learned about things like light energy, chemical energy, mechanical energy, there's hydroelectric energy, there's all different types. And so essentially all we're saying here is that energy is just changed from one form to another, but we're never creating energy from nothing, and we're never destroying or getting rid of it. It's just being transformed or transferred. And so a very common example of this is photosynthesis, and that plants use light energy from the sun, and they convert it into chemical energy, which is food, like glucose. Another example would be cellular respiration, where we take chemical energy in the form of food and we turn it into that chemical energy that we just saw called ATP. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is a bit more complex. Okay, I'm going to be honest with you that when you start throwing in words like universe, it becomes a very abstract concept. And so we also have a new term here, which is entropy. And entropy is defined as the measure of disorder or randomness. So not only do we have randomness, but we also have the universe, which once again makes this pretty abstract. But once again, you just need to know what the law states. So for every energy transfer or transformation, the entropy of the universe increases. Okay, this is important here because we're going to see this term again. The entropy of the universe increases, which means every time the energy is transformed or transferred, the randomness or disorder of the universe is going up. Okay, now randomness just happens. Okay, it's spontaneous, whereas order is going to require work. In order to maintain order, we're going to have to put some work and energy into it. And one of the reasons why the randomness of the universe is always going up is almost every energy transformation is going to give off at least a little bit of heat, and heat is a random type of energy. So as the first law states, the quantity is constant. All right, energy is not created or destroyed. However, the quality of that energy is not constant. It can vary depending on what form that it's in. So life requires order. This is why we are an open system, is because we are constantly exchanging and taking in energy and things from our surroundings. So a living system, if we're looking at just the system, entropy can decrease or it can increase. But if we're talking about the universe, it's always an increase. Now, I want you to think about order for just a moment, and I want you to think about that by thinking about your bedroom. I always use this example, and it's always kind of made my daughter mad, but you know, as a parent, you really start to notice cleanliness and order when it comes to your kids' rooms. And more than likely, you're probably thinking about your own parents, and they're nagging to pick up your room or to clean your room. And so the thing is, order requires energy. Okay, order is always going to require energy. Randomness or disorder do not. They're spontaneous. They just happen. So I want you to think about your room getting messy. Do you have to put any energy into making a mess? So maybe you leave your clothes on the floor. Maybe you have Sonic drink cups on your nightstand. Maybe you have books, folders, anything. Maybe you don't put your clothes away. Maybe you take a shower and your towel is thrown onto the bed or thrown onto the floor. Maybe you have trash. Whatever it is, you don't really have to put in a lot of effort to make your room messy. It just kind of happens. It's like you go in one day and it's a disaster. Okay, you don't really think about doing it. You don't really put energy into doing it. It just happens. Now, as soon as your mom or dad ask you to clean your room, that is when the attitude begins and the sign and the groaning of, oh my gosh, it's so much work, right? In order to put everything back in its place, you're going to have to input some energy. And so in order to maintain order, you're going to have a constant input of free energy, because that randomness is just going to happen. And so in a living thing, that disorder is going to spontaneously happen, okay? So in order to make sure that we maintain the order, we have different biological processes and cellular processes that are going to ensure that we can keep that order in our cells. All right, so that takes us to free energy. Now, free energy is the energy that's actually available to do work, okay? So just because you have a certain total amount of energy doesn't mean you can actually use it to do something. And so here we have a chemical equation, and in chemistry, you probably manipulated these variables and probably solved for these variables. The good news is we are not going to do that here, okay? What you need to understand is what these variables stand for, and you need to know their relationship, okay? We're going to look at free energy in relationship to chemical reactions, and so you just need to know what they stand for. So the triangle here, hopefully you've seen this before in math or in chemistry. The triangle is a delta symbol, and that means the change in. And so in order to calculate free energy, we have the change in total energy minus the absolute temperature, which we're really not going to worry about this variable in this scenario, multiplied by the change in entropy. Okay, so remember that the entropy was the randomness or the disorder. So G is free energy, H is total energy, and S is entropy. And we're going to look at this in terms of our catabolic pathways and our anabolic pathways. Now, we can put reactions in one of two categories. We have exergonic and endergonic. You probably have studied endothermic and exothermic before. Those would fit under one of these two categories. And so exergonic reactions release energy. And then remember that anytime we are releasing energy, we're breaking things down. That is just going to happen, okay? That's going to be a spontaneous type of reaction. And then endergonic reactions are requiring energy. Energy has to go in, and so these are going to take in energy from the system. These are going to be non-spontaneous, and we're going to be storing energy here. So I want to go back to our chart here, and that we now have two reactions. We have endergonic and exergonic, okay? So if catabolic pathways break down and release energy, then exergonic reactions would go here, because exergonic reactions release energy. And if anabolic reactions build and store energy, endergonic reactions would go here, because they are going to store energy. Now, another thing I want us to look at are the variables in our equation. Okay, so if you need to, go back and look at the equation in the previous slide. But here you can see that exergonic reactions are going to release free energy to the system. So if you're releasing the free energy, it's no longer going to be available to you. You're giving it away. It's going away from you. And so what's going to happen is, if it's an exergonic reaction, let's see, gotta find my, if it's an exergonic reaction, then we have a negative. I'm just going to do a G. I don't have the delta symbol handy. It's going to have a negative free energy, okay? Now, if I'm storing energy, then I'm going to have a positive free energy. It's going to be increasing. All right, so now go back to your equation before. If my free energy goes down, then my total energy, which is H, is also going to go down. And if my free energy goes up, then my total energy in the system is also going to go up. Now our last variable is entropy, which is S. And so our entropy is going to have the opposite relationship of our energy. If I'm releasing energy out into my surroundings, that is going to increase the randomness, okay? Because anytime we have those spontaneous reactions that are releasing, they are going to increase the randomness or disorder. So my S is going to be positive. Now on the other hand, if I'm storing the energy, I'm making those bonds. By storing it, I'm actually decreasing the randomness. And so therefore entropy is going to go down. Okay, so for quiz purposes, well, I guess we really don't have a quiz, but for test purposes, you do need to know these variables. Okay, and you've got some practice questions in your study guide that I would encourage you to look at. Now, one other thing that I want you to add to our chart is that anytime we have exergonic reactions that are breaking down, releasing energy, remember that these are spontaneous. And anytime we are storing energy and building, these are going to be non-spontaneous. Energy is going to have to go in for us to do those things, okay? All right, so that's going to finish up our chart. I believe that's everything that we need to add. If not, we'll come back and take a look at it. But just be sure somewhere, because when you're studying, it's really important to kind of pair all of these terms together. And for example, you could be asked a question like, which of the following terms doesn't belong? And so obviously there's some words that go together here, there's some words that go together here. So I would definitely kind of study in this chart format. All right, so what I want to do over here is I want to take a look at some graphs. And you should be able to look at a graph and recognize it as either endergonic or exergonic. Now here you have them labeled. On a test you would not, okay? But you could see a graph and it could ask you what type of reaction it is. And so in any reaction, there's always going to be energy initially, okay? And the energy is always going to go up at the beginning, okay? That's called the activation energy, and we'll look at that when we talk about enzymes. But some reactions are going to release energy, which means the products will have less than the reactants. And then some reactions are going to store energy, which means the products will have more than the reactants. And so if you're trying to decide if it's endergonic or exergonic, you have to look at which one has more energy, the reactants or the products. So here's my reactants, here's my products. If my products have less energy, energy was released, and that makes it exergonic. Now here's my reactants, here's my products. Okay, in this case the products have more energy, and therefore energy must have gone in. That would be endergonic. All right, so be sure you're able to read the graphs. All right, the last thing is metabolic disequilibrium. Now normally we want balance. We want equilibrium in so many different areas. We want to maintain homeostasis. But in the case of energy, if we were to reach equilibrium in our system, essentially that means dead. Okay, remember that we are an open system, and open systems need a constant input of energy. Okay, it needs a constant exchange with the surroundings. We cannot maintain order without a constant input of energy and materials. And so in an open system, we don't ever want to reach equilibrium. We actually want disequilibrium. We always want more coming in, okay, because that is what allows us to maintain order in a living thing. And that is going to take us to the end of Metabolism Part 1. So we will come back tomorrow and we will focus on enzymes which regulate our metabolism.